So, oh, lovely. Thank you so much. And we'll start with introductions. So you will have to unmute yourself for those as well, but it's just good to make sure we're not talking over each other, have any background noise. I'll start. I am Pastor Adam Barnhart, pastor at Shepherd of the Hills Lutheran Church here in Flagstaff, up on Hospital Hill. And I don't know, do we need a claim to fame this time or something? Yeah, we made it through the Christmas season by the skin of our teeth. Everything went really well, but my family was sick with like 3 or 4 different diseases, none of which were COVID. So it's amazing that the common cold still exists in 2022. That's enough for me. Rabbi?
I'm Rabbi Nina Perlmutter, and I serve a congregation of Shalom, which is on the east end of Flagstaff, but I don't live there. I live in Chino Valley, Arizona, about an hour and a half away. And I've loved learning and participating in this.
And I will go around the circle here and just have people unmute themselves and introduce themselves. Oh, got another participant. So Vicki, you're the first one on my cycle.
I'm Vicki Carroll. I'm one of pastor's parishioners at Shepherd of the Hills in Flagstaff, and I'm on the church council also.
And we're glad to have her. Jarvis, you're next.
I'm Jarvis Kerr, and I live in Winslow, and I'm principally interested in your project. I'm a master gardener, and I have the Methodist rose garden to maintain
Cool.
in Winslow.
Very nice. Barbara.
Hi, everybody. I live in Prescott Valley. I attend the Temple Brit Shalom Synagogue in Prescott, and have been here for about 3 years, loving Arizona.
Mike Scott. You're muted, Mike.
I'm Mike Scott. I go to Shepherd of the Hills, and sort of a gadfly wandering around stirring up trouble.
He said it. Everybody's witness, and it is recorded. So that's a beautiful thing. The Browdies. Muted.
Oops.
There we go.
Judy and Bob Rowdy, members of Congregation Lives Shalom in Flagstaff, and both on the board.
Yeah, and one comment, Mike, we're still gonna get that Lefkas together once the COVID passes.
Another good idea of Mike's.
Another good idea.
Looking forward to it.
Bill and Linda.
I'm Linda, and this is Bill. And Jarvis, I'm also a master gardener for many, many years. We live in, sort of live in our new house in Prescott amidst the boxes and the clutter as we try to, we're best friends with all the various charities. They could say, oh goody, what do we have now? That's where we are.
Oh, thank you for being here. Tom.
I'll turn that off. Yeah, I'm Tom Broderson. I'm using Nina's microphone because if mine's on, I get too much feedback. I'm Nina's husband, Rabbi's husband, which makes me the Rebbitzin and some.
Or Hubbardson.
Yeah. Awesome, Tom. Peggy.
Tom, would you turn off that heat?
I'm Peggy Lammer. I am one of pastor's flock, and I am on the council. I'm the president.
Yeah, she wields the real power around here. I'm just the hired help. I just show up, part-time and do things. So always lovely to see you, Peggy.
Thank you, Pastor.
Karen.
Let me turn the light off so it's shining in there.
Karen, you're still muted. Ah,
There it is.
there it
Okay.
goes.
I'm Karen, and I'm from Prescott, like Biscuit, Arizona. And I belong to Temple Bris Shalom also.
Perfect. Thank you, Karen. Jake and Donna.
Hello, this is our first time, so we're curious to see what's going on. And we're Adams people.
I'm their people. Let's be honest. That's the way this works. I'm delighted to have them. I'm excited to see what goes on too. It's always kind of a marvel. Julie.
Hi, I'm Julie, and I'm a member at Shepherd of the Hills for 8 years now. So that's me.
Thank you, Julie. John.
Well, I'm kind of a wanderer. I go to Shepherd of the Hills. I've been there for quite a while, and I really like this group. Really stimulates the mind.
We love having you. John's a thinker. If you ever want, we ought to pair John and Mike up sometime just to have conversations. That'd be delightful. That'd run to no end. Chris.
Is it Chris?
So I'm Chris, and I'm Jake and Donna's son, and I live in Phoenix. I belong to a Lutheran congregation, Faith Lutheran Church, but a few years ago, I was also had what's called a Chaver membership at Temple Gan Elohim in Phoenix. That means a friend membership, because I wasn't a full member, but I was attending there for a while.
Good to have you, Chris. Whenever Chris visits Flagstaff, he makes sure my liturgy's on point. He's excellent. Always good to have. Lanny.
I'm Lanny Morrison. I'm a member of Congregation Love Shalom, and my wife and I live in Gold Canyon, which is the far east valley of the Phoenix area.
It's good to see you, Lanny. We miss you up here. Lori.
I am Lori Perlmutter, and I live in Flagstaff, and I'm a member of Congregation Love Shalom. But I work in Prescott during the week, and I was just on my way there tonight, and I was all packed, ready to go, and my tire light went on. So I took it right away to Discount Tires, and it just didn't need air. They needed to repair the whole thing. So I had to come back, and I have to run off tomorrow morning for an early morning meeting. But I'm glad I made it here.
I'm sorry to hear that. Vehicle repairs are the worst.
At least I saw it and it didn't happen on the road or something.
Absolutely true.
Good timing. I think there's a couple that we didn't hear from.
Yeah, Dan.
That's Craig is my middle name, and I go by that, and Diane McAllister. And we're new people to Shepherd of the Hills, and this just sounds like an interesting function, so we're checking it out.
Excellent. And I get to have tea with you guys next week. I'm excited about that.
Yes, you are.
Very good. So, and I'll get the name straight at some point for certain. All right, so we're going to dive right into it. Each of these flows kind of in its own unique style, depending on what we're approaching in terms of story or content. And the plagues are going to be no different. The intent, as I started to look into it, I realized that there's some background with the plagues that are just, it's simply good scripture study, good biblical study that I know my congregation needs to do. And it might be good for our Jewish friends as well, or maybe just review. But either way, I thought it would be good to dive into each of the individual plagues, because the pretty magnificent thing about the plagues, and I'm getting this set up here, is that they are all tied, each of them is tied to a specific or several different Egyptian gods, which was absolute news to me, which is fantastic. So let's see if I can do this. Can you see my screen? And is it just the PowerPoint presentation? Nina?
Yeah. With
Is it?
Yeah, I can see it.
Yeah.
Okay, very good.
I can see it.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk us through the plagues, and Nina will add in a little color as we go along. And then at the tail end, we'll get into a little bit of interpretation. But I found this I found this infinitely entertaining and also super helpful in understanding what was going on with the plagues. And so the first thing that we need to recognize, I think as a Christian pastor, frequently we read the plagues in like just a straight continuity to the Passover event, and we didn't really ever dive into the singular plagues. And but what's going on in those plagues is a divine fight every step of the way. It's the Israelites versus the Egyptians pantheon. And you'll see that as we move through this, and they just keep cranking the stakes up higher and higher and higher through all the plagues. And so each plague has a purpose. Each plague has a specific thing it wants to say about the Egyptian gods and how inadequate and unworthy they are in comparison to the Lord, to Yahweh. So here we go. See if I can make this play. So the first plague, Nina, do you want to take turns reading Bible?
Okay, your version.
Yeah, sure. It's what's up there.
And let me just say that the plagues in Jewish life, we look at them quite a few times. And what Adam and I decided I was going to just sort of show you when we get to each one individually that, you know, some of the ways that kids or the kids within us try and make it more real is by demonstrating things. So for example, you want to start?
Sure, this is a good long one. I'll read fast. Exodus 7, this is what the Lord says. By this you will know that I am the Lord. With the staff that is in my hand, I will strike the water of the Nile, and it will be changed into blood. The fish of the Nile will die, and the river will stink. The Egyptians will not be able to drink its water. Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord had commanded. He raised his staff in the presence of Pharaoh and his officials and struck the water of the Nile, and all the water changed into blood. Then the fish of the Nile died, and the river smelled so bad that the Egyptians could not drink its water. Blood was everywhere in Egypt. But the Egyptian magicians did the same things by their secret arts, and Pharaoh's heart became hard. He would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said. Instead, he turned and went into his palace and did not take even this to heart. And all the Egyptians dug along the Nile to get drinking water because they could not drink the water of the river. Yeah, you want to do your visual, Nina?
Okay, so at the Passover Seder, which is one of the more famous times when we're going to be talking about the plagues, just so blood, right? The first plague is blood, and some people, I grew up with little masks, you know, you pass around masks that says blood. It's going to sort of show this with blood. How many did we go through? Going back, how many did he just read?
Just one.
Just one. Okay, so that's the first. I was actually looking at the next, at Exodus 9. So that's why I was a little off with what you were reading. Okay, go on.
Next one, or so with this water being turned into blood, did it go back to my PowerPoint?
Yeah.
My amateur Egyptologist PowerPoint. There are two gods identified in the Egyptian pantheon that are affected by this or are shown to be inadequate by it. The first being Khnum, who's the guardian of the source of the Nile, supposed to keep the river pure, supposed to be the source of life that the river is. Frequently appears with a ram's head, which you can see on the slide right there. And the interesting part about it is Khnum is not just the guardian of the source of the Nile, but also considered to be the creator of children's bodies. Because when the Nile would swell, it would bring all that silt and mud down the river. And that was considered the primordial piece of humanity. And so being able to corrupt the river with blood, turn it to blood, was a direct strike against him. The other person, other god, is a goddess, Hapi, who is the goddess of fish and flooding and is also tied to fertility. Sometimes you see her with a fish's head. It's really interesting, but more typically the depiction is what you see there of her holding a couple of different ceremonial rods with fish tied into that depiction. And so all the fish dying clearly says Well, this God doesn't have any clout either. So those are the two gods that first plague strikes at. First, the god of the source of the river, and then the goddess of the fish. Neither of them could be protected. Neither of them could do their job when Israel's God came to bear. Right, second plague is the frogs. And we're just continuing on in Exodus. We'll be in Exodus 8. Nina, do you want to read this one?
Sure. And then the Lord said to Moses, go to Pharaoh and say to him, this is what the Lord says, let my people go so that they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go, I will send the plague of frogs on your whole country. The Nile will teem with frogs. They will come up into your palace and your bedroom and onto your bed, into the houses of your officials and on your people and into your ovens and kneading troughs. The frogs will come up on you and your people and all your officials. Then the Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron, stretch out your hand with your staff over the streams and canals and ponds and make frogs come up on the land of Egypt. So Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs came up and covered the land. After Moses and Aaron left Pharaoh, Moses cried out to the Lord about the frogs he had brought on Pharaoh. And the Lord did what Moses asked. The frogs died in the houses, in the courtyards, in the fields. They were piled into heaps, and the land reeked of them. But when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he hardened his heart and would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said.
Do you have something froggy for us, Nina?
We have little frogs. We have napkins with all plagues. Here's a napkin of frogs, finger dolls of frogs, hopping frogs, etc.
So cool. So, and you all will catch on to this pretty quick, how this flows with these Egyptian gods and goddesses. It does get a little more entertaining as it goes along. The second plague, though, is really straightforward. Hecht is the goddess of generation, birth, and fertility. And you see her with a frog's head in almost all depictions I saw. And birth and fertility was tied to frogs because, once again, it's about the Nile, and it's about the flooding and the regeneration that land would see during the flooding of the Nile. And the frogs would just populate during the flooding. And so what happens here is all this rejuvenation and life that people usually see in frogs becomes overwhelming, and then it becomes piles of stinking death, which is a pretty big slap in the face, once again, to a specific god in Egypt's pantheon. So, third plague, gnats and lice. Then the Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron, stretch out your staff and strike the dust of the ground. And throughout the land of Egypt, the dust will become gnats. They did this. And when Aaron stretched out his hand with the staff and struck the dust of the ground, gnats came on people and animals. All the dust throughout the land of Egypt became gnats. But when the magicians tried to produce gnats by their secret arts, they could not, since the gnats were on people and animals everywhere. Nina, do you have gnats? I'm really entertained here.
Just lots of them.
Oh, it's cool. Not the cool mask. Super, super cool. So swapping between sharing and unsharing here. So, oh, that should say gnats and lice, not frogs. Sorry, this was a pretty quick PowerPoint. Geb is the god of dust and earth. And so in that passage in Exodus I just read, every time dust is referenced, that's a specific reference. It's a specific dig on this particular Egyptian deity. And of all the figures you see on the screen right now, Geb is the one on the very bottom here laying down. And he was the earth. He was the foundation of the earth, the god of everything that lay beneath. And so being able to turn the dust, the earth, into these horrible bugs was a direct strike at Geb. And hang on, well, this image will show up again, and we're going to learn a couple more of these Egyptian deities as we go along, because there's 3 of them here, and none of them are spared during the course of the plagues, which is really interesting. On to the 4th. I can make my computer behave. Flies.
The 4th. Then the Lord said to Moses, get up early in the morning and confront Pharaoh as he goes to the river and say to him, this is what the Lord says, let my people go so that they may worship me. If you do not let my people go, I will send swarms of flies on you and your officials, on your people, and go into your houses. The houses will be full of flies and the ground will be covered. But on that day, I will deal differently with the land of Goshen, where my people live. No swarms of flies will be there, so that you will know that I, the Lord, am in this land. I will make a distinction between my people and your people. This sign will occur tomorrow. And the Lord did this. Dense swarms of flies poured into Pharaoh's palace and into the houses of his officials. Throughout Egypt, the land was ruined by the flies.
What do you have for flies, Nina?
Just little flies.
That's still good. It's better than what we have.
I say keep going.
Yeah,
I'll wait for the more interesting ones.
they're too
Okay.
small to show.
Too small
Okay.
to show you.
So the god that is being beat about in this plague is Khepri. I'm probably not even close on that pronunciation. Khepri is, as you can see, it's kind of a creepy looking picture. Head is that of a scarab. And you see this on all the depictions I've seen, and it's just very jolting to have this scarab sitting up on top of the shoulders with hair flowing off of it. But this was considered the god of daybreak and renewal and creation. And so for flies to come in, the flies, which are of course not the sign of renewal and creation, but the sign of decay, is thought to be in opposition to this particular god in the Egyptian pantheon. All right. Next.
Yeah, I'm having a hard time following.
Okay. Fifth plague is cattle. Then the Lord said to Moses, go to Pharaoh and say to him, this is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says. Let my people go so that they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go and continue to hold them back, the hand of the Lord will bring a terrible plague on your livestock in the field, on your horses, donkeys, and camels, and on your cattle, sheep, and goats. But the Lord will make a distinction between the livestock of Israel and that of Egypt, so that no animal belonging to the Israelites will die. The Lord set a time and said, tomorrow the Lord will do this in the land. And the next day the Lord did it. All the livestock of the Egyptians died, but not one animal belonging to the Israelites died.
Cattle.
So though, are those shown, Nina, during the meal? How are those used?
Well, different Jews will do it differently, right? I have a whole collection of these kinds of napkins, and I'll ask people to raise it if they have that plague, and different folks get the different masks, and this doesn't happen in every house, but I mean, this is
You
sort
might
of what
mention it's done with whole
we've been
families, so
doing.
it's something to sort of entertain the kids.
Yes, it's entertaining the kids, but it's also making it what you're reading more vivid, okay, in whatever ways. So sometimes I'll just distribute them all and people have to find what they have and then, raise it, et cetera, et cetera. I also want to tell you that our order at different parts of the Bible, some of these come in different orders. So keep going.
Very good. All right. So with the cattle, this is a pretty one-to-one ratio in terms of which god they think is being addressed in it, and that's Hathor, who is a goddess of love, fertility, and protection. And you can see her poking out from the bulrushes here in the upper right side of that papyrus. And she's either depicted fully as a bull, like in that picture, or simply with the bull horns, which are those black kind of almost mustache looking things going off the top of the head as part of her depictions. And so Moses being able to, and Aaron being able to come in and command that all these cattle are going to be struck down by God is a direct slap in the face to Hathor and to that particular individual in the Egyptian pantheon. The fertility, everything that comes from these cattle that the Egyptians depend on is going to go away along with that God that's supposed to oversee them, that God has no power if all your cattle die. So very much a bad thing.
I'd also add that my understanding is there's Hathor, who was more the cow goddess, but there was also a bull god, APIS, Apis, I don't know how to pronounce that. So it's sort of getting them both.
Yeah, yeah. And we'll see that later ones too. There's frequently male and female deities associated with each of these ideas. Sixth plague, boils and sores. Nina, you get a fun one.
Okay, this is one of my fun ones. Here's boil masks, little boils, and I like popping, what do you call this stuff?
Bubble wrap.
Bubble wrap, you know. The boils and sores. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, take handfuls of soot from a furnace and have Moses toss it into the air in the presence of Pharaoh. It will become dust over the whole land of Egypt, and festering boils will break out on the people and animals throughout the land. So they took soot from a furnace and stood before Pharaoh. Moses tossed it into the air, and festering boils broke out on people and the animals.
So there are two gods, a god and a goddess associated with health, typically in the Egyptian pantheon. The first is Isis, and she is the goddess of healing and rejuvenation. And her depictions are amazing. If you go searching for her images, she's frequently depicted with these fiery wings, these intricate, beautiful wings. And it was worshipped as the goddess who brought about healing from disease, healing from the very things that everybody was being afflicted with, from this ash that was tossed in the air. The other god that was addressed in this is Imotep, who is a really interesting figure, because Imotep was actually a healer, an architect, a consultant. I mean, the guy had a lot of roles in the early Egyptian dynasty. I think he was in the second dynasty. But after he died, just because he was so revered, he became a god of healing. And I didn't find any depictions of him up on the wall, but you will see lots and lots of statues of him, exactly as you see on the page here, sitting with a scroll, because he was such a learned individual that became his depiction as a god. Once again, though, supposed to be a god of healing, and boils and sores were not getting healed. So it kind of shot down Imotep in all of his glory. And if any of you have watched that really action-filled movie, The Mummy, from about, I don't know, 15 years ago, Imotep shows up in that movie. It's a little over-dramatized and whatnot, but it's kind of interesting to find the roots of it actually in Egyptology. So on to the seventh one of hail. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand toward the sky so that hail will fall all over Egypt, on people and animals, and on everything growing in the fields of Egypt. When Moses stretched out his staff toward the sky, the Lord sent thunder and hail, and lightning flashed down to the ground. So the Lord rained hail on the land of Egypt. Hail fell and lightning flashed back and forth. It was the worst storm in all the land of Egypt since it had become a nation. Throughout Egypt, hail struck everything in the field, both people and animals. It beat down everything growing in the field and stripped every tree. The only place it did not hail was in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites were. Nina, do you have anything for hail?
Yeah.
Hail, hail.
Hail, hail.
Oh, the beads are an interesting. So with the seventh plague, hail, we get back to, I told you to remember that particular image of three gods and a goddess. And hail was meant to address these other two in this important cosmic picture for the Egyptians. You have the god of earth on the bottom that was already addressed with the dust. And now with this one, Nuit and Shu are being addressed in this plague. So Nuit is that goddess of the sky. You can see she is just adorned with stars overarching everybody. And then in between earth and sky is Shu, the god of wind and air. And it's really interesting. This plague is hail and it's violent weather, because Shu is known to be a calming god in the Egyptian pantheon. It's that soothing wind that's supposed to blow through the area. And so this plague takes that idea that heaven and earth are calm and safe and beautiful for the Egyptians and tears it apart and shows that the Israelites' God has command over that, and that these two gods on this particular one do not have that kind of strength over the sky and the wind that comes from it.
And my understanding is that this plague is also relatable to Baal, the god of thunderstorms.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, and he falls outside the traditional Egyptian pantheon. So yeah. All right, 8th plague, we're moving right along. The locusts. So in the 7th plague, it's worth noting, I didn't actually paste that in this Exodus text, but when the hail comes and wipes out the fields, it only wipes out the plants that the Egyptians would have used predominantly for brewing, for their libations, and for clothing. And it notes that in our text that the grain, the wheat, wasn't actually ready to be ripened yet, so it wasn't affected by that. But with the 7th plague, it comes around and catches up with them. So my turn to read, Nina, or yours?
Mine. And the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over Egypt so that locusts swarm over the land and devour everything growing in the fields, everything left by the hail. So Moses stretched out his staff over Egypt, and the Lord made an east wind blow across the land all that day and all that night. By morning, the wind had brought the locusts. They invaded all Egypt and settled down in every area of the country in great numbers. Never before had there been such a plague of locusts, nor will there ever be again. They covered all the ground until it was black. They devoured all that was left after the hail, everything growing in the field and the fruit on the trees. Nothing green remained on tree or plant in all the land of Egypt.
So now that the land has been wiped clean between the hail and the locusts, everything is gone. And this is one of those, like Rabbi Nina referred to earlier, this is one of those god-goddesses pairs that are very closely tied to one another in Egypt. And Nepir and Nepri, probably murdering those two names also, but they were the respective god-goddess of the grain and harvest, and depicted, of course, with grain bundles in hand or in front of them. And we're supposed to be the ones overseeing the food of the Egyptians and making sure that came in from the field to sustain them. Not happening when clouds and clouds of locusts wipe them out. All right, we're winding down, or rather up on the plagues. Darkness, lots of exclamation points. This is the one where it really kicks up quite a bit. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand toward the sky. Just a second, let me reduce this. I can't see the whole thing. So that darkness spreads over Egypt, darkness that can be felt. So Moses stretched out his hand toward the sky, and total darkness covered all Egypt for 3 days. No one could see anyone else or move about for 3 days. Yet all the Israelites had light in the places where they lived. And this one brings in, of course, we haven't gotten to Ra yet, but we need to get to Ra. And Ra, as you probably know, is the god of the sun for the Egyptians. Ra was the most powerful, most revered god, father of all the other gods, oversaw everything, and was absolutely the most worshipped god in all of Egypt. All the other gods we have gone through up to this point could be considered relatively minor in comparison to the worship that occurred around Ra and everything associated with him. So for the plague of darkness to come over the land, and not just kind of light darkness, but darkness you could feel, I love that term, is this obliteration of the most powerful god that the Egyptians have. It is just taking the top dog, public enemy number one to some extent, and just saying, no, this God has absolutely no power in this context. Our God can even overrule your most powerful and your most worshipped God. And so the 9th plague being darkness is key, because up to this point, we've moved through minor gods in the Egyptian pantheon. And now we arrive at the big dog, so to speak, and boom, even he cannot stand the force of the Israelites' God.
And I would add that Pharaoh was understood to be a son of Ra, and therefore could claim to be a god himself.
Coming up next. So with the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn. Nina, is this your read?
At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and the firstborn of all the livestock as well. Pharaoh and all his officials and all the Egyptians got up during the night, and there was loud wailing in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead.
And so Nina pointed out correctly that the God that's addressed in this final, oops, and that should be not darkness, but of course, death of the firstborn. The God that is addressed in the 10th plague is the Godhead of the Pharaoh. And Pharaoh claimed to be the son of Ra, claimed to have divine power. And so what you see on the screen, and I'm not going to read all of it though, comes from the first chapter of Exodus, where the Israelites are becoming much more prominent in the land of Egypt under Joseph, and Pharaoh starts to fear them. And so this is where he commands that every Hebrew boy, firstborn, will be killed. And so this is echoed in Exodus 12, in this final 10th plague. The Pharaoh's commandment to kill all the firstborn is superseded and is done even more dramatically by the Israelites' God. And so they, I believe, and Nina, you can correct me if this is incorrect, that it would be read with this in mind, that you would hear this as an echo of what the Pharaoh had done, and that they were coming back over on top of it.
What goes around comes around.
To some extent. So that's the amateur Egyptologist presentation right there. We got through the 10 plagues, and we tacked on all the gods that are associated with it, which is kind of a fascinating journey to see that these plagues were not just happen chance. God wasn't just pulling out, I'm going to do hail this day, or I'm just going to do flies this day. But there were likely direct ties to the gods that the Egyptians were putting forward, and they were being countered by these actions. Nina, you want to do some interpretation?
Well, what I wanted to do first, actually, thank you, Adam, for that, is I wanted to give a little more background in understanding the plagues and the series. And again, I mean, I don't even know, maybe I should first ask, when Christians are looking at the plagues and considering them, in Jewish life, interestingly enough, the past 2 weeks in our Torah readings have been reading about the plagues. The first 7 came two weeks ago, and then the last 3 just came. Passover, of course, is the most famous use of the plagues. So I just want to say that it's the plague story as part of the Passover story is really probably the defining story for the Jewish people, because with the plagues is going to come the Exodus and coming together, et cetera, et cetera. But what most people don't focus on is also true about the plagues. You may have noticed some of the plagues impact both the Egyptians and the Israelites, the Jews. Some don't. So I just thought that I would go through 1 to 10 and mention a little bit of this. There's the interpretation that, number 1, the turning of the Nile's water into blood is seen as a response in part to the shedding of Israelite blood throughout their slavery period. And this is an important part of the story. The invasion of the frogs is seen as impacting, the Israelites' jobs were included loading all the Egyptian freight, and the frogs are coming and destroying that. So they are living through that as well. Even the lice, the earth turns into lice. Well, the earth turns into lice, and that makes it harder for the Israelites who made the clay and made the bricks out of the earth, right? So their lives are impacted. When the cattle and the livestock and all that, the Israelites had been forced to tend to all the herds in Egypt. And now the pestilence came and killed those herds. So it certainly impacts the role of the Jews there. The wild beasts, the Israelites had to gather all kinds of animals for use by their masters. And so during this plague, we're told that the beasts were attacking the humans as well. And that means some of them are going to get bit, etc. The boils, covered with boils, made it impossible for anyone to bathe. And the Israelites were the ones who drew the baths for the Egyptians. So that's going to change their work, etc. Hailstones, they were the stone cutters, the Jews were the stone cutters in the creation of all the pyramids, etc. And so it's going to put a pause in their work as that's coming down. They tended all the fields and all the vineyards. Well, no more fields and vineyards with the locusts. So it's going to impact them in that way. And because the darkness is seen as an invitation or a requirement that the Egyptians are going to experience a darkened life as they had darkened the lives of their slaves. And of course, the killing of the firstborn is this follow-up, as we talked about, to the earlier effort, Moses, in a basket, etc. It had been the policy to kill the children, kill the firstborn. And so it resonated. That's what I'm trying to say. It was a resonating in some area, in some of the plagues, as we read, it only happened in the Egyptian neighborhoods and not in the Jewish neighborhoods. But in many of these plagues, it was impacting or reflecting or just showing more real than the Egyptians could understand before the life of the Israelites among them. That's what I want to say. I guess what I wanted to share, if I didn't know, Adam, if you wanted to go elsewhere, but I wanted to sort of give a little more on punchlines of these stories. Are there Christian punchlines from the plagues?
Why don't you go ahead and finish your thoughts, and then I will go into our interpretation of where we conclude with this and where it lands in our readings.
Okay. There's a lot. I guess we could start with, if you haven't noticed, bad things happen. Bad things happen in life. And in Jewish life, we're not in denial that bad things happen. Clearly, as Adam was accenting, these stories, the set of plagues are meant to show not only Egyptians, but also the Jews, that the Yod-Heh Vav-Heh, the Jewish God, is bigger and behind all of life, the good and the bad. There's been a lot of discussion in Jewish life and And many people, when they read these plagues, particularly at Passover, they don't like it. It seems mean or whatever. In part, that's why I wanted to share some of the tithes for the Israelites. But I wanted to say that at the Passover Seder, as each of these plagues are read, the Talmud, the sages insisted that Jews remove a drop of wine or juice, which symbolizes joy, must remove and decrease their joy even with liberation. Why? Because the Egyptians are also created by the divine, and we are not to be too happy. We're not to be too joyous that our liberation came with the pain and sorrow or death, even of our enemies. We have enemies, but the teaching is that we are to be merciful. And even though this is what it took to get Pharaoh to shape up, we are not to be too happy about that. So I wanted to mention that. I wanted to say that to know the larger context gives a few other important lessons. If you read before the plagues start and after the plagues start, there's 40 years in the desert. The sages say it was easier to get the Jews out of Egypt than to get Egypt out of the Jews. And what does that mean? That slavery and oppression impacted their minds, impacted their hearts. That's why it takes 40 years to really become free. It's even said in Exodus that the Jews had been crushed by bondage. And you have all through the Exodus story, Jews are mad at Moses. And at one point they say, hey, it's better to be a slave than to, put up with all this, what's going to go on. So that idea, we're supposed to identify with all characters in the story. But what slavery, what limits are we so used to that it's not so easy to suddenly become free. Identify with the Pharaoh. We're supposed to see, where is my heart hardened? We're told that Pharaoh's heart was hardened. And the habit, we're taught, of meanness or whatever, our hearts can be hardened, and it becomes harder and harder and harder to change. So where can I identify with Pharaoh? Where can I identify with Moses? You might remember that before the first verse we even read, Moses doesn't want to do this. He's humble and he doesn't think anyone's going to listen to him anyway. And he talks about his limits. Where can we identify with any of these? But again, in this great freedom story that follows the plagues, I also want to say the Jewish context is always, the goal isn't just to be free. The goal is to be free to serve something higher, to serve God, etc. So it's let my people go. They're not always easy to lead. They're not necessarily wanting to be free, but it's not free just to be me. It's free to be a community and to serve God. Maybe that's enough for now, and then I'll come back to a few other things.
Excellent. Let's pause there for questions. Any questions for Rabbi Nina about the interpretation from that? Lori.
Actually, this is for both of you, because it seems like on what you had us read, Pastor Adam, is that Pharaoh's heart was hardened, or he hardened his heart. And the way we always read it is God hardened his heart. And that's always like a lot of a discussion for us. Like, why would God harden Pharaoh's heart? And what does that mean? And so I was just curious.
That's a really apt point to dig into. And I know that Christian interpretation varies on that point in terms of how it's been translated, because the same kind of theological conundrum exists. If God is hardening somebody's heart in the midst of these plagues, then isn't God just bringing these plagues on them again and again and again? And so, yeah, no, it's a point of conversation in our tradition as well. And so you will see, so the readings that we had up on the screen were New Revised, New NRSV, New Revised Standard Version. And that sways more to Pharaoh being an actor on the hardening of the heart, which simplifies things a little bit theologically. But I am no Hebrew scholar by any stretch of the imagination. And so I can't speak to the nuances of that translation specifically.
Well, I guess I would say that actually in the Tanakh and the Hebrew Bible, it appears in both ways. There's Pharaoh harden, and then God hardens. And I was sort of alluding to that before. It raises a lot of things, including what kind of God are you dealing with? In general, the God Jews feel we're dealing with is above it all. Behind it all is God, and God created the world and created us. We have choices, and there are consequences. And so in a way, it's really a typical both and story. Pharaoh hardened his heart, Pharaoh hardened his heart, Pharaoh hardened his heart. And at some point, we're told God hardens the heart, because Pharaoh, if you think of two things. One is think of God, and the other, Eric Fromm does a lot of this kind of talk. And Eric Fromm actually came from a rabbinic and Jewish background. The way we were created is that if we keep choosing this, that, and that, it's harder and harder for us to change. Does that make any sense? All right. So the whole is such that we have choice. Pharaoh kept choosing, I'd say, the wrong choice. And then after a while, he couldn't even do it differently. Our habits come from our choices. We have both choice, but it's also built in the consequences. That's at least the beginning of a conversation. Maybe we can do more.
Good question, Lori. Very good question. Anybody else questions at this point?
Looks like Lori has another.
Well, I have a question. If others don't.
I think you're good to go.
What we're told to do at our seders and in life is read these old stories, try and figure out both in context, and we are told right after the 10th plague, actually in this week's week portion that we just did, that we're never to forget the story, because it is such a defining story of our people. And we're also told to remember and make relevant for our lives. So what most Passover Seders I go to, what I raised earlier, we're invited to now think of what are the plagues of our time? What are some plagues of our time that are coming from choices or that we are making or not making? What are some problems that we find are somehow impacted by the choices we make? What are some of the situations of slavery that we need to do our part in helping free. We need to become like Moses and helping reduce bad things. The idea, you should know that the Hebrew word for Egypt here in the Bible is Mitzrayim, which means tight space. Tight spaces. What are the tight spaces that we personally or as Americans or need to leave behind by changing our choices? What can we do? The plagues were signs of problems and signs of possibilities. So as we move towards Passover, and as we read this now, I'd invite us to consider that. It's very, very real.
So I was going to throw in a really quick piece on where this shows up in the Christian lectionary, at least the mainline Protestants and Catholics use what we call the lectionary, which is our cycle of readings that include both Old Testament and New Testament readings. And the plagues as a whole don't show up in the lectionary. But what does show up is that 10th plague, the killing of the firstborn, and then the Passover event. And that shows up once during our ordinary season, just kind of, I don't want to say randomly, but it seems like kind of a strange occurrence. So that usually occurs during the summer every 3 years. And then the other time that we see this reading of the 10th plague come about is on Maundy Thursday, which is included in the readings for our Holy Week trajectory from Jesus entering Jerusalem to his death on the cross to the resurrection on Easter Sunday. And that occurs on Thursday when Jesus is celebrating the Last Supper with his disciples. And that all plays into the idea of kind of where Christians arrive with the plagues. And that is really at the end. The focus, the emphasis is on that Passover and the salvation that God provided for the Jewish people, for the Israelites, in that moment with the blood of the Lamb marking those doorways. And so that is refigured in the person of Jesus in Christian thought. And Jesus is referred to and has been referred to for centuries and centuries and centuries. One image for him is of the Paschal Lamb. So as this salvific lamb that is the refiguring of the salvation that happened in Egypt, Jesus is going to come again in that salvific way, right? And his blood becomes the same as the lamb's blood over the doorway. So that's the refiguring of the Passover in Christian thought. Jesus becomes the lamb and the blood that is spilled for salvation. Now, all that being said, that is fallen in and out of favor in about the past 50 years in Christian thought. So that idea that Jesus's blood has to be spilled for salvation to occur is referred to in Christian theology as atonement theology, a very specific vein of theology. And atonement theology was very prevalent for hundreds and hundreds of years. But in the past 50 or 60 years, theologians have raised questions about atonement theology. And you see varying opinions on whether or not sacrifice is the language that needs to be emphasized when we talk about Jesus. And tying Jesus to that Passover event is something that we necessarily want to do all the time. The argument away from atonement theology is a little complex, but it basically takes the road that there is so much more to Jesus than simply his blood being spilled. And those theologians that want to emphasize away from refiguring the Passover into Jesus's death, emphasize that Jesus's teachings and his healings and those things that he did are far more important and far more essential to Christian life than simply his death on the cross. And that atonement theology oversimplifies who Jesus is and what Jesus has done. It just takes one little piece of that entire trajectory of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection and just focuses on it. And so theologians that move away from atonement theology want to emphasize a broader picture of Jesus and de-emphasize the blood sacrifice as the essential or core characteristic of salvation as defined in Christian theology. So that's where it occurs in our readings. But once again, the emphasis is on the tail end on the 10th plague and the Passover. And that emphasis is placed there because we see it reoccur in our Holy Week trajectory as we talk about Jesus heading towards that death and that sacrifice. But once again, it's been called into question theologically, kind of profoundly, definitely worth noting in the last half a century or so. Any questions about that? I might have used language that doesn't make sense. Let me know. Yeah.
Can I make a comment?
Sure, Jarvis.
If the last 120 days doesn't make you familiar with a plague, and I've overheard some people who have come through this, but who are still suffering. And so my question would be, how would knowing what we discussed earlier apply to this to make us happier, as it were, or to make us feel better? You understand me?
What are you talking about in the past 120 days that you're citing?
Seems like there's a world crisis going on now, like a plague. They call it COVID.
Definitely.
And it's affected people here who are in the program right now. And the question is, based on what you and the rabbi know, how would you approach that to give people comfort?
Rabbi, do you want to take point on that one first and I'll follow up?
Well, again, I'd say a few things. I'd say that we have to always take the sort of larger view and the sort of this too shall pass also kind of thing. But again, what I was trying to emphasize is that the Jewish point of view always says things will change, things can get better, but we can't just pray for it. In Jewish land, we are partners with the divine in moving forward. And that's why I mentioned in the very beginning that it wasn't just these examples to show, the God, the bigger God. The Jews were supposed to be seeing that too. So this idea that I believe the plague of our times, and I either know personally or know of through people I know, almost 20 people who've died of COVID and almost 50 people who've gotten it. I do believe that there are things that humans can choose to do, like wear masks and get vaccinated, etc. That we have to do our part. The Jewish teaching is that we can't just pray and ask God. We have to choose and do our part in moving forward. So, and also, I don't even know, and this would be an interesting topic someday, how good and how happy your vision is of what life can be. From a Jewish point of view, we say l'chaim, to life. But there is never a sense that we can have a life without problems and without pain. That's why we have to choose to stay in touch with three things. Our sense of the divine, community, and our higher sense of ourselves. But there is no sense that this life is going to be without hard things. Actually, all the plagues, virtually all the plagues, and I've seen this, I'll send it to you if I find it and you're interested. Virtually all the plagues, versions had happened naturally. versions of all those things had happened naturally, but these were sort of accentuated, natural things accentuated. So the good can be accentuated, the bad can be accentuated. It can get better, but don't expect it perfect. And what the hell am I doing as my partnership with God to help us move faster forward?
That's a great model. I would echo what Rabbi Nina said, but I would step back just for a second and say that was part of the question that bringing up the plagues was going to raise, because you do see it in the media, you do see it in other places, people referring to COVID as a plague. And if we refer that word directly to what we read in Exodus, then there's this idea that God has brought it on for a reason. And I don't see the purpose in that. And pandemics and other things can befall humanity without having to attribute those directly to the causation of God. That doesn't have to be there in terms of causality. But this is where I tie in really close with Nina, is there are plagues in the midst of the struggles of life. And I think one of the major plagues we see in the midst of this particular struggle in this particular time is the divisiveness and the lack of kindness and the lack of love that we have been showing our neighbors through this pandemic. And that is a plague. And I think that's a plague that we can really easily find as something, well, not a plague as in God brought it on us, but it is an evil that we need to work against. And so I wouldn't look for divine causation in COVID. That is not something I find purposeful. And I think you have to walk a long ways for that. But you see that kind of thinking occur again and again and again in human history. When something major befalls humanity, you usually have a subset of the population that said, oh, God brought this on because. And usually there is something else behind that rhetoric that people are looking to fuel. You know, it's something more than just the pandemic, but they're looking for a specific vein within it of certain behaviors. You know, I remember hearing about that during, regretfully, the AIDS pandemic. People said, oh, God brought this about because of these people. And of course, that was completely repugnant theologically and ethically, but that was used as the same kind of tool. And so I am, one, very cautious to run into saying anything naturally occurring, even something as extensive and as devastating as this, has divine causality. I don't see that, and I don't believe in a God who does that. And so my hope lies in what we do in the midst of this, which is exactly what Rabbi Nina was talking about. My hope lies in our agency and our activity with the divine in this, and what we choose to spread besides germs. So
I guess I'd also like to say that for thousands of years, these kinds of theological issues have been debated, you know, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, et cetera. But we can figure some things out. But, and I think the idea of the divine, the bigger source behind it all, who set up a world with good and bad choices and this and that, really makes sense. But, you know, we also have the book of Job, which would say, be careful if you think you have the final answer. There's plenty of things that we can't totally figure out as well, you know. And so different ideas of God, different ideas of why bad things happen. You know, the famous book, it's When Bad Things Happen.
To good people.
To good people or whatever. Not why things happen, but when things. Again, the Jewish punchline is get in touch with that part of me that is in touch with what I'll call the divine mystery community and my better self.
Bill and Linda, you
Yes.
have a hand raised.
Yes, I do. First of all, the only thing unique about COVID is that A, it's man-made, and B, it's gone around the world. However, in 1918, there was a similar plague that also went around to the world and nobody was spared. And the Roman Empire ended because of a plague, probably pneumonia, that went through the whole place. So, you know, God does send these things to us, or allows things to happen to us. So, you know, like I said, the only difference about COVID is it's highly politicized, and you know, you can't trust anything you see or hear.
It has definitely been politicized to the nines. I think that's maybe been the most exhausting part of this entire pandemic.
Can I say something to make people feel worse or better?
Oh, sure,
If
Lori.
you read, first of all, there have been pandemics about, if you look back at pandemics, there's been epidemics about every 15 years. There's been pandemics about every 50 years or so. I don't know what all the details are. But if you look at the 1918 flu, you can see everything we're doing now was done exactly the same way. People screamed at each other. There were riots. They screamed about masks. They didn't want to do this. And when you look at other pandemics, you know, the Black Plague, the same exact politicized. So it gives me hope that it'll eventually end, but it also makes me so sad that we don't seem to learn anything. People were fighting against masks during the bubonic plague, even though they knew they worked. It's pretty, I mean, it's sad that people keep having to repeat, and we don't quite learn anything.
I think there's some scriptural basis for that about us being stubborn people, or I know, and it sounds very familiar, Lori. Thank you, though. John.
Why did I lose Adam?
There we go.
He's there.
I'm just thinking, you know, you talked about three things that are key. And one of those keys were community. And I was just thinking about the plagues we're dealing with today, you know, the COVID and global warming and extreme nationalism, refugees all around the world. And really the key to answering all those, because we're supposed to do something, right?
Mhm.
Is community. If we don't have a sense of broad community actually all around the world, we'll never be able to address these problems. So I think you're right on target with one of your three basic premises. So that's my comment.
We have a bookmark on our refrigerator. It said neighbor is not a geography term. It's a moral term.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Absolutely awesome.
But I have a sort of a statement of what I really like about this particular session is that we took some stories seen from slightly different perspectives, ran them through into the current situation and trying to relate the current to the past. I mean, I think that bringing that forth, and so certainly the way that that Jarvis started it, and Lori's comment about, you know, we've been there before. When do we learn? I mean, that's right on. I mean, just again, it's not just the story archaic, but yeah, it has relevance to our current time. And damn it, we should do something about it. Maybe we learn, maybe.
Well, and I think that, Bob, and you know this is one of my core convictions, I think that emphasizes the power and the importance of telling stories, period. Is that we are doomed to repeat what we've done in the past unless we tell stories about our history and about who we are and what we've done. And because if we omit that record, be it oral or however else, if we omit that record, then we have no hindsight. We have no ability to apply the past to our present and learn from it. And scripture is a prime place to pull these stories from. I mean, that's why I sit in this office, is because there's such depth and wisdom in all of these things we read. That interpretation is a key piece of who we should be. And we should be interpreters of these stories and draw them into our present time. Anybody?
I'd like to do one comment and then I need to sign out. I recently read a book called Peacemaker Code. And it's written by a professor from Harvard. His last name is Malmotra. His first name is Deepak. He does a lecture on YouTube about what we're talking about, in that one of the things we have to understand if we're having a conflict is how the other party, he teaches negotiation, by the way, and he's negotiated in the Middle East, which has been a concern of mine for about 45 years, why the Palestinians and the Jews can't resolve this terrible, terrible conflict. Because they need each other due to the fact that they have separate holidays. When one can't work on one day, the other fill in and keep the power plant running. Anyway, he gives a lecture on YouTube to the Harvard graduating class where he discusses how we can deal with a bunch of conflicts. And basically, if you consider the virus a conflict, you can begin to get some insights on some things that we can do to solve some of the problems of the world. And so I advocate for people who are interested to read that story.
There's something that Lanny can relate to when I've lectured in his class on medical ethics. But there's a famous case, and I'm not going to go into it, called Designer Baby, and it ends with something like the following. And how can we be so arrogant to believe that our view is the right view? And basically saying that if we want to understand, we have to sit across from where we are in the seat of the other person and try and understand from where they're coming. That's not done. I've not done it.
We have so many divisions that we could apply much better ethics to. Oh man. Any other questions, thoughts? This went a long ways. This had legs tonight, folks. Mike.
Unmute yourself.
I think he's working on it.
There we go. I pushed the right button. So I'm struck. We live in a democracy, a republic. We have no notion of kingship. It's interesting. Moses represents the God of the Israelites. Pharaoh, the king, represents the gods of Egypt. The poor guys making the bricks or fishing on the riverbank, they don't realize they are caught up in a cataclysmic battle between forces far beyond them. As what happens to the king or the leader in each case determines the fate of everyone. And I throw that out. We need to remember that, as Galileo taught us, we aren't the center of the universe. I mean, the sun's going to come up tomorrow if those larger forces want it to, no matter what happens to me. And you got to kind of, I think, keep that in perspective, lest we get too self-reflective of the woe is me, everything's terrible. You know, kids still run and laugh and play. So that's my 2 cents.
Good perspective. Good perspective, Mike.
And the Jewish practice is, no matter how lousy the day is, we're supposed to stop 100 times a day to notice something that we can be thankful for and give thanks to the sources you understand that. If you go to services 3 times a day, you get a lot of those in. But I often say this because I find it a very helpful practice. For me, it's about every 16 minutes a day. But no matter the crap, no matter the hardship, if we stop, take out a moment, look around, and I'd even say, who was it? who joined us for the first time down here. This Hevruta group, this group of folks or something that I'm thankful for too. So we're not, no matter how bad it's been, there's plenty that's good and there's plenty to be grateful for.
Absolutely.
When's the next one planned?
I think we said February 16th, is that
16th
it?
sounds correct. It's that Wednesday of following Valentine's Day. So if I survive Valentine's Day, we will have another session.
Okay.
Thanks a lot. I enjoyed it very much.
Well, thank you all for attending. This is kind of a
Thank
fun
you.
one.
Take care. Shalom.
Thanks. Shalom.
Have a good night, everybody.
Good community.
And everyone.